Bystanders were shocked as they watched an airplane spin out of control and crash into a house. And in this video, we're going to explore all of the facts and talk about what happened.
Yo, what the? Yo, what the?
My name is Hoover and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. And as we start by looking at some of these photos from the mishap, I just want to say I'm always a little reluctant initially to talk about mishaps right after they happen, especially because being a former Air Force Chief of Wing Safety, I know how important it is to the investigation process to let the investigators do their job. And you also want to respect the families and the victims as they're dealing with the aftermath of this tragedy. And when you look at some of these pictures, it's amazing that one person was able to survive and no one in the home was injured. On board the plane was Michele Cavallati, an Italian national. He was only 22 years old and he was the flight instructor. And then you have Barrett Bevacqua. He was 20 years old and a rated pilot, but he was trying to get his multi-engine certification. And his father said that he was pursuing his dream of becoming a commercial pilot. And then you have 20-year-old Emily Hurd. Now, she was the only survivor on board, and my guess is the reason that she survived is because she was in the back of the plane, combined with the fact that the roof of the house probably cushioned their fall even just a tiny little bit. And oddly enough, all three of them are roommates, so it's just a very tragic mishap that we're talking about. And the aircraft that they're flying was a Piper PA-44 Seminole operating out of Hillsborough Aero Academy at the Portland Hillsborough Airport in Oregon. This is a picture of the aircraft. The Piper PA-44 Seminole is a twin-engine light aircraft manufactured by Piper and is primarily used for multi-engine flight training. Now, they departed from the Portland Hillsborough Airport and they headed to the south, where it looks like they ended up doing some maneuvers or maybe some training right before they crashed. And they're starting to slow down right in this area here when they entered the spin. And remember, there's only two things that you need to spin an aircraft, and that's stall and yaw. That's why it's so important to get training to recognize the onset of a stall, so that way you know what those indications are and you're able to safely recover the aircraft before you find yourself in a dangerous situation. But when it comes to spins, at least in the US, student pilots don't get spin training when they go to get their private pilot's license. However, everyone that becomes a certified flight instructor will get spin training on a single engine aircraft. When it comes to multi-engine aircraft, intentional spins are prohibited because they're too dangerous, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, if you lose an engine or if you have asymmetric thrust in a multi-engine aircraft, that's going to create some yaw that you're going to need to counteract by using the rudder. And this image here shows a conventional twin-engine aircraft that has clockwise rotating props. And that's going to make the left engine the critical engine, because if that engine fails, the thrust from the right engine along with some other factors is going to create a stronger moment arm that's going to push the nose to the left. Now, the good news is that the Piper Seminole has counter-rotating props, so there is no critical engine. And we don't even know if they had an engine failure, but this is an important concept that you need to understand if you're flying multi-engine aircraft. When we go back to the video here, we don't see how the spin started, but we don't see any smoke trailing the aircraft, so we can probably rule out an engine fire, but that doesn't necessarily mean that both engines are working right now. So the NTSB is going to be looking very closely at that. And what you're seeing is a fully developed spin, and these can take a lot of altitude to recover from. And you can see in this image that in a fully developed spin, the airplane is going to begin a tight rotation with the spin stabilized. The airplane is going to be at a low airspeed and a steady rotation rate, and that's what we saw in the video. And we can see in the data here that when they initially start losing altitude, it only takes about 2 seconds for them to go from about a 250 foot per minute rate of descent to about 2,300 feet per minute. And then just 4 seconds later, they're losing about 8,500 feet per minute of altitude. And I have to point out that this image is showing a single engine aircraft. So remember, with a multi-engine aircraft, you want to recognize and recover before the spin even starts. And the way you're going to do that, according to the Piper Seminole training supplement, is throttles idle, rudder full opposite direction of the spin, and then the control wheel, you want to release that back pressure. You're trying to reduce the AOA. and you need to go full forward on the control wheel if the nose doesn't drop. Keep in mind that a single engine aircraft is going to recover a lot faster than a multi-engine, so even if you have full rudder input, that recovery phase isn't going to stop that rotation immediately. You can see here it's talking about that rudder is going to counteract the rotation. It's going to allow the spin to develop into a steep spiraling dive from which a normal recovery can be made, assuming that you have enough altitude. Now that brings us back to the data. We can see that as they're heading southeast, about 1 minute prior to being in the spin, they have a very shallow climb, gaining maybe about 200 feet while losing about 50 knots of ground speed. There were no radio calls made during this time, so we don't think that there was any type of emergency leading up to this, but we also don't know the exact reason why they're slowing down. But we can see that they're about 5,400 feet above the ground when they start losing altitude and enter the spin. And the Piper Seminole training supplement says you should be at least 4,000 feet AGL if you're doing things like slow flight, stall training, or a VMC demo. So we know that whatever they were doing, the altitude they were at should have been sufficient, but let's talk about what might have caused the spin. Remember, all you need is stall plus yaw, so let's talk about stalls. The training supplement walks you through the power on and the power off stall procedures. These are basically getting you familiar with stalling when you're trying to take off or when you're flying around the traffic pattern. The data that we have shows that back here they're 86 knots and 5,400 feet, but remember this is ground speed, so we don't know what the winds are at altitude, so we don't know what their exact indicated airspeed, but the maneuver for power on stalls says to slow to 80 knots before transitioning to 15 degrees pitch up. And as we see the airspeed start to decay here, we never see the altitude increase, so I don't think they're doing power on stalls. And also, if we look at this, I don't think they're doing power off stalls either, because with these, you're supposed to establish a 400 foot per minute descent at 75 knots, and I just don't see that in the data. But I know the NTSB is going to be looking closely at this because you have to stall an aircraft before it can spin. And according to the training supplement section on stall recovery, you can see how they talk about how aggressive you need to be with that reduction in AOA. You've got to unload by releasing the back pressure on the control wheel, and I think some pilots may not realize how aggressive you need to be and how you might need to actually push forward on the control wheel in order to reduce the AOA to get the aircraft flying again. If you don't get that nose down, all it takes is a little bit of yaw before it's going to spin. And the training supplement mentions 2 times where an unintentional spin might occur. One is during a VMC demonstration when you're reaching both the VMC and the stall simultaneously, and the other occurs while you're maneuvering during slow flight. So we're going to take a look at each of these scenarios starting with slow flight. You can do this in a clean or a landing configuration, and the point is to avoid activating a stall warning because you're trying to get comfortable with flying the aircraft around at a slow speed without actually stalling the aircraft. So at the very first indication of stall, you're going to recover. But again, keep in mind that when you're doing slow flight, the point is you shouldn't be stalling the aircraft. Now let's talk about the other issue, and that's the VMC demo, and then I'll share with you one crucial detail that I think the NTSB is going to look very closely at because it might have made this spin unrecoverable. VMC is the minimum airspeed at which directional control can be maintained with one engine inoperative, and it's marked by a red line on the airspeed indicator. And the manufacturer calculates that speed for you based on the most unfavorable conditions possible. However, something that you need to be aware of is that in the Piper Seminole, the VMC speed is basically the same as your stall speed. And we've talked on this channel before how you can stall an aircraft at any airspeed. You just need to exceed the critical angle of attack. And the point of this is just to recognize in this aircraft, if you're stalling it, you might be on the verge of losing control of it, especially if you lose an engine right at the wrong time or if you don't know how to recover from it. And when you're doing this demo as outlined here, it's very important to thoroughly brief and chair fly this maneuver beforehand, or even do it in a simulator first, because the recovery steps can seem counterintuitive when you're doing it for the first time. You're going to have one throttle back to simulate a dead engine, and the other one will be up at full power, and you're going to use the rudder and a little bit of bank angle in order to maintain your heading. And as the airspeed decays, what you're trying to do is recognize when you can no longer maintain directional control, and that's when you recover. And remember, because your VMC is basically the same as your stall speed, when you go to do this demo, some of the instructors will actually block the rudders, and that means they're going to artificially limit how much rudder input you can make. Because if you can't use full rudder, that's actually going to increase your VMC speed, so you're going to recognize the signs of losing directional control well before you get to stall speed. And the recovery is the tricky part because you've got to reduce the power on that good engine because that's going to reduce the yaw from it, while simultaneously decreasing the angle of attack as necessary to regain directional control. But you're not done with the demo yet, because you've got to continue the recovery by increasing power slowly on that operating engine while maintaining an AOA that allows for your airspeed to increase to a point where you can still have directional control. Now, let me be clear in saying that we don't know if they were doing a VMC demo or if they were doing stall training or slow flight or something else. We also don't know if maybe they had a catastrophic flight control malfunction, and we don't know what the engines were doing because maybe they were doing one of those maneuvers, and as they're slowing down and approaching stall speed, maybe one of the engines failed. We just don't know yet, but there's one item in particular that I think the NTSB is going to take a close look at when it comes to this investigation, and that's the aircraft center of gravity. Remember that Emily is the third person on this aircraft, and with her in the back, that's going to shift the center of gravity aft, and this is going to result in a lower stall speed. So if you're doing a VMC demo and maybe you're used to hearing the stall warning horn go off and that's your cue to recover, which it shouldn't be, because again, you should be recovering as soon as you have a loss of directional control or the stall warning horn, whichever comes first. But if you're waiting for that in this situation, because of that aft CG and that lower stall speed, it's possible that you're actually going below your VMC and the aircraft is starting to turn already, and you're just not recognizing that you've lost directional control as you're waiting for that stall warning horn, and then all of a sudden the aircraft is in a fully developed stall. The other problem with an aft center of gravity is that it's going to make it harder to recover from a spin because the rudder is now closer to the center of gravity, so it's going to have less authority to counteract that yaw. So regardless of how they got into the spin, it was going to be very challenging, if not impossible, for them to recover. But we need to wait for the NTSB to finish their investigation and respect that process and respect the families as they're dealing with this terrible tragedy. And my thoughts and prayers are with them and with Emily as she tries to recover from this. And if you learned something from this debrief, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.